I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
As you could see from our background here, me and the team flew out to Simi Valley, California, the Reagan Presidential Library, to record a bunch of podcasts with folks at the Reagan Defense Forum. We spoke with CEOs, venture capitalists, and policymakers as we work to confront and answer the big question of 2024, can the United States maintain the deterrence that is so a part of President Reagan's legacy? Hope you all enjoy these conversations. Joe Laurienti, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you for having me.
So we are recording this live from the Reagan Presidential Library, despite the booth we're in. It's very beautiful outside of us, I promise. But this is for the Reagan Defense Forum. So let's just start here. What are you doing here as a founder and a CEO?
This is our third year now attending the Reagan Defense Forum, and we found it was a great fit for us because the attendees are typically a mix of really the three kind of constituencies that we really have to involve ourselves with. So we have policymakers left and right. We have senior Department of Defense officials and government officials. And we have really every kind of prime or more and more recently innovative defense company around us. So as a company building technology that impacts really all three of those, this is the perfect event for us.
And what is so interesting about your personal background is that I think your career perfectly encapsulates the broader story of the post-space shuttle space system in the United States, in the sense that you work for SpaceX, Elon Musk, you work for Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos, and now you've launched a, rocket propulsion company in this space that they very much validated with their early success. So let's just kind of start. How did you get where you were up until founding that company?
I love that you tied it to the space shuttle. I had never pieced together when talking about the history of Ursa Major. I graduated college the year the final shuttle launch happened. So you're exactly right. That era of human spaceflight in the U.S. hit pause for, probably 9 years or so. The U.S. was not flying NASA astronauts out of the U.S. So when I was graduating, if you wanted to work on something really innovative in space, you could think about what NASA and, DoD and the primes were really working on. The innovative pieces were much further out. It was Mars orbiters. It was experimental scientific payloads. Think James Webb. SpaceX was this standalone where they were privately funded. I like to equate SpaceX to the post-John McCain era, where Senator McCain was really kicking down doors, pushing that the U.S. had to stop buying Russian rocket engines. And it took a company like SpaceX to come along and develop the U.S. technology and the U.S. know-how to kind of build a new industrial base around space. So as a new college grad, I wanted to work on something here in the U.S., wanted to work on something innovative, but something that we would see come to practice very quickly.
What's so fascinating here, and I want to highlight the Russian space engines aspect of this, because if this is going to be a theme throughout the day of conversations, but there's this clear narrative of, wow, in the 1990s, things went wrong in some respect, and now we have a new generation of policymakers and founders trying to correct for those mistake areas.
Exactly.
And it seems like one of those mistake areas, maybe at the time it made sense, was the dependence on Russian rocketry. So can you give the context for A, why that happened, but B, why that was a problem that needed to be addressed in the 2010s?
Really good question. I've dug a lot into why did the U.S. become so dependent on Russian, really, I'll call it post-Soviet propulsion, because Russia and Ukraine, obviously Ukraine is friendly to the U.S., but they were both proliferating propulsion worldwide, not just to the U.S. And the best kind of causal chain that we found was there was sort of an olive branch extended to the Soviet Union post-fall, and a lot of that had to do with talent and technology and how were we allowing this former Soviet Union to partner with the West. The former Soviet Union was fantastic in their space program. They were 40 years of competitive Cold War era space interactions. So they had these fantastic rocket engines, and we said we can use them here in industry. We have At that point, we had the shuttle program. We had our kind of post-ICBM space launch efforts. But the interaction with the former Soviet Union on the propulsion side made it feel much more commercial when we were launching satellites. So it did make sense in the 1990s. There was this kind of diplomatic effort to partner on a technology in a commercial sense. It created dependency, though. We really stagnated our industry. And if you look at there are two extremely prolific rocket engines here in the U.S. that we have built. One is called RL-10, still flying today. It is America's workhorse engine, been flying since 1962, 400-something successful flights. So that was Cold War era technology that has evolved. But the second is SpaceX's Merlin engine, only flew for the first time in its current form in 2012, 2013. So huge gap in kind of domestic manufacturing and technological know-how around propulsion. But we filled that with former Soviet Union propulsion. So when I think about the challenge it created this lag in U.S. know-how, U.S. talent base. Think about the average U.S. technological worker might be in the workforce for 35, 40 years. Mm-hmm. If we have a stagnation of no real technological development for 20 years, you're skipping a generation of know-how. So that was really problematic. The second piece, though, it doesn't really answer your question, but the second piece is we created a world of proliferation of technology coming out of the Soviet Union only, the former Soviet Union only. The U.S. was not selling propulsion overseas, and it really, I think, today what we are facing is not just this domestic know-how and manufacturing and industrial-based challenge, but we are facing a diplomatic challenge in that we can't go help our friendly nations on space launch to the extent we should be.
And what's so interesting about the experience you've had is that in many ways, and this is why I was referencing your time at SpaceX and Blue Origin, we're kind of seeing a repeat of the history of early Silicon Valley in the sense that there are these early successes. Think of like Hewlett-Packard, et cetera, where everyone kind of like works there and they kind of spread out. Like in the defense place, everyone kind of starts at Palantir, then they kind of go out. So you started at SpaceX, you were at Blue Origin, you recruit people from those places, then you build new companies. So like, what would you say is the difference between the work you're doing at Ursa Major, good chance you'd introduce the company, obviously, and let's say the work you were doing at Blue Origin and SpaceX?
Yeah, perfect opportunity. I'll give credit to one of my friends. I won't mention his name or where he works just because I didn't ask his permission, but he's been a Silicon Valley kind of VC and insider for a long time, and he expressed that what he has seen in space over the last couple of years reminds him of 1980s, 1990s, college students in garages building things, and we're seeing that on the space side as opposed to the PC and software side. So it's really exciting. I think it's all enabled by what SpaceX and Blue Origin did, and this kind of makes sense from an evolution of an industry perspective. We started with space being a meaningful proportion of the U.S.'s GDP. We needed the entire U.S. government, the Defense Department, NASA to invest in an effort in space for it to be viable. The next step of that, unfortunately, was billionaires having to use their own net worth to go fund these efforts. So Elon and Jeff pulled together their net worths for their endeavors. The next step, though, is build a viable marketplace and a path to that marketplace that is within the economic means of something like Silicon Valley, where you can privately fund it with VC dollars. So
you are not a billionaire, is the key thing we're relating up to.
Far from it. Though it would make Ursa Major quite more productive if I were. But I guess kind of to introduce our company and why that was really meaningful, the shift that I had seen from a product perspective or a mission perspective was, again, nation states shooting to get to space. In the case of Blue Origin and SpaceX, these were big endeavors that had to be privately funded to the tune of billions of dollars. So you were not going to go find investors that said, yes, we will front billions of dollars before we see any revenue or any market traction. But it was clear to me that there had to be a next step in that. And that next step was find the technological and product niche that we could fill within the means of a venture capital investment. So Ursa Major I describe as it's kind of the Pratt & Whitney or the GE or the Aerojet Rocketdyne of the venture capital era, where we can raise private capital to fund product development for some of the most important propulsion missions here in the U.S. And our first marketplace was space. Our second marketplace, second being when we were 5 employees, so very early on, is Hypersonics. And now we are 200 employees, and we are entering the kind of solid rocket motor tactical munitions world as well.
So you're actually the first founder CEO person who's interacting with VC space that we're having on the podcast Arsenal Democracy. So I think for our listeners' sake, I'd love you just to kind of explain how venture capital works, because there's a lot of subtext to what we've just been discussing in the sense of, you're not going to just raise billions of dollars. There's a longer timeline. What basically is the key difference between, let's say, us getting together to fund or raise money for a B2B SaaS app and building in hard/deep tech like you're building? Because these are just fundamentally different categories where it's just so hard to do.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on as the first kind of VC founder. That's really cool.
We want to have someone who's building, because the kind of mix is the key thing here.
That's awesome. This was a learning experience. I mean, I was a propulsion engineer when I started the company. So we raised our first venture capital round, I think 6 years ago now. So we really had to learn what does a venture capital model look like? And at its heart, you can think about the phases. There are the really early phase venture capitalists that look for small investments that can turn into 100x returns. And they will take a good number of those, and they will expect a lot of them to fail and a few to succeed. And what that means is, in the early phase of our business, when we are out raising capital, we have to show our path to becoming a massive company early on. And in the case of Ursa Major, we had to show this huge need in space. We had to show that the U.S. was falling behind adversaries, falling behind China in space launch. SpaceX was beginning to prove what they could do as a private entrant, but that was just one tiny piece of the story for space. We were not going to just see SpaceX launching 10 satellites a year and being happy about it. SpaceX now is building their own satellites and launching Department of Defense efforts, and foreign nations are paying SpaceX to launch satellites. So we had to build that vision in space and then show that was just one piece of our story. Beyond space, there was this need in hypersonics. There's this upcoming need in solid rocket motors, and a future need in even air-breathing propulsion for drones. So the message that we have been saying for years is propulsion is a massive problem. And very recently, we've seen that come to light with solid rocket motors in the industrial base. But that's the early phase of venture capital. Later on, you have to really prove that that vision you laid out is staying consistent, and your technological path, your team growth, your know-how is fitting what the market is asking for. So we were really lucky when we raised our first venture round. We were selling engines into hypersonics already as a 10-person company. That was partly timing, partly our technological fit, but it started to show that this vision we had for the problem of propulsion in the U.S. was already kind of bearing itself. And so here we are, I guess, 6 years later, and really what we want to show is, along the lines of that vision, we can execute. We can go become an operational company building and selling propulsion products to all three of those segments that we are currently in.
Yeah, and something that anyone who's spent time around VCs will know is something you do as a founder is you put together like a slide deck. And one of the slides, and this is kind of the cliche, but it's also like a useful mental exercise, is just like the problem. Like the problem slide. You've referenced the problem, but I think for everyone here, like, what would you say 2023, December 2nd, what is the problem in rocket propulsion that you or any founder of your caliber should be working on solving? This could be like a commercial problem, but could also, of course, be a defense-centric problem, given the fact that we're at the Reagan Defense Forum.
Yeah, I'll probably focus on the defense side, because there is this interesting nuance that 6 years ago when I was raising our first round, I would say the word defense, and venture capitalists would ask me to leave the room. It was not a world they wanted to invest in. And we've seen that change dramatically over 6 years. So I'll really
pause. Let's talk about talk about those 6 years. I'd love to hear like the evolution over like your timeline too.
Yeah, 6 years ago when we were raising our first venture capital round, we had this great team, and we had this problem that we had identified, that propulsion in the U.S. was lagging and going to become a huge bottleneck for what I would consider the most important efforts of national security, economic development, and that we see space as this huge economic driver, and even just resilience. We now have Starlink satellites beaming internet to parts of the world that couldn't receive internet. Space and propulsion are the linchpin in all of those. So when we were raising capital, we wanted to show that we had an approach that could drive down costs, it could reach more users, and again, I guess kind of to that Rolls-Royce, GE, Pratt & Whitney model, we wanted to bolster the entire industry with the right propulsion products. So over that 6 years, what we've done is build out an incredible team. We have really some of the best engineers in propulsion in the world that love that vision. They didn't want to go to a company where propulsion was just a piece of the story. They wanted to go somewhere where we were betting our important mission and our important products on their skill set every day. We now have products, like I said, in space, hypersonics, and missiles. And kind of back to your first question on the problem, what did we identify? What we saw was the U.S. was going to have a gap in its launch capability in space, and it was going to have a gap in its new product and ability to refill defense systems, all driven by propulsion. So what do you
mean by refill? So if we use a system.
Exactly. One of my favorite kind of recent anecdotes there is the amount of Stinger missiles that we've shipped into Ukraine. These are missiles that the U.S. didn't plan to build any more of, but a new need emerged, and the only way we could refill that arsenal of Stinger missiles was to stand up a 40-year-old factory that we had never planned to reboot. So our approach, whether it was space or missiles or hypersonics, was this really technologically driven, flexible manufacturing approach. We want the ability to build a next-generation rocket engine or a current-generation missile system without needing to build a factory that uses 40-year-old technology. So we do a lot of 3D printing. We do a lot of kind of new metallic materials development and what I would consider kind of design for system-level integration. So we have a team of engineers that is agnostic whether they are working on a Patriot missile or a Stinger missile. The kind of process and manufacturing is the same. And that, I guess, kind of coming full circle, when you explain to a venture capitalist, we have this approach and this technology that completely upends how things have been done for 40 years. It's pretty exciting. They can see that path to a really massive opportunity across many markets, not just one key fit.
Something I'm curious about, like you said, you're actually starting out, unironically, in the garage with like a small team. Like, how is that possible in these high capital categories? Because it kind of goes against, because once again, you kind of think of it would go the opposite way of like, hey, like I've got like my smart friends who work at FANG companies. We're just going to like work in our apartments and like code this thing
go write
up.
some code.
How is it possible that the space ecosystem is having that model work, at least when you need to kickstart the engine, really?
Well, a big part of it is be naive to how big the challenge is. I didn't understand really that we were at risk of shutting our doors every day, wasn't taking a salary for the first couple of years, that type of thing. But what made it cost effective was the manufacturing. Our focus on 3D printing meant we could go build a hypersonic engine that the world had never seen with, call it $500,000 and 5 people in an attic. So $500,000 is a lot of money. We still had to go find a way to capitalize that, but the push was much smaller than we need to go build a factory, again, a 40-year-old factory that we have to stand up and staff. So the manufacturing piece was a really big part of that.
I'm curious, what has your experience taught you about the means by which the United States funds and just supports ventures such as yours? So, for example, like you could think of like InQtel at the CIA, like the CIA's venture capital arm puts some money into Palantir, kind of serves as a validation arm. That's obviously government putting money into venture capital. As we started pointing out, like a lot of founders in the early space were billionaires who could afford to just throw their own money away till things worked. Obviously, the American system is not going to be one where, you know, the DoD is sort of like, hey, like here's $1 billion to get started.
That'd be really nice.
Up and coming. But yeah, I guess how does it work? How should it work? What are the gaps that you're encountering? Or if anyone who has your experience and knowledge is going to see?
It's definitely changed over the years. I mentioned when we were 6 employees or so, we sold a hypersonic engine. So that was to an AFRL program. And
what's that?
Air Force Research Laboratory. Sorry. Thanks. We use a lot of
Pretty
acronyms.
good at acronyms.
We use a lot of acronyms in aerospace.
We reached the limits of my acronyms.
Good. Please grab me if you notice. And so we had an Air Force Research Laboratory contract to sell a hypersonic engine as 6, maybe 10 employees. That showed those venture capitalists there was what they call product market fit. There was a buyer for the technology we had, and even if it was kind of not perfectly aligned with the vision that Air Force Research Laboratory had, or it wasn't the perfect product, we were directionally aligned. There was a future for what we were doing. So that was a small contract. I mean, I won't guess a number, but it was a smaller contract than the amount of money we were asking venture capitalists for. And so that is an early model. You can think about SBIRs, Small Business Innovation Research Awards. I think that's correct. Small Business Innovation Research. These are small contracts, but they begin to show product market fit. They show venture capitalists and investors that you have the right idea. Now, what we've run into over the last few years, when I say things have changed, is a lot of times those contracts do not have a path to something much bigger. You don't have, like you said, DoD saying, here's $1 billion to go try something. So you really have to show that you have the right demand signals. And it's really difficult in DoD. A program of record takes 5 years to shape, or
if what's a program of record?
A program of record is it is a defense spending program that is written into appropriations language, meaning it is you have years of identified spending toward that program. So that is the perfect,
which is what you need to actually plan and build and do things.
Exactly. If you have a program of record, meaning the Department of Defense has signed up to give you a certain amount of money for your products over a certain number of years, that's when you can go to investors. You can even go to banks and say, this is a very traditional business contract. I need a line of credit to go accomplish against it. What's missing is what is in between those small business contracts and those programs of record. So we've luckily seen Department of Defense really try to pull companies in with new contract mechanisms. Other transaction authorities are a good example, where you can get a larger, meaning tens of millions of dollars, but it's still not a production contract. What we had to really show in the early days was why it's kind of a culmination or an addition of signals. It is, what I'll use today as an example. We have depleted years, probably 10 plus years worth of munitions in Ukraine just in the last 2 years. We have depleted 5 years worth of Iron Dome Tamir missiles in Israel in the last 3 months. And we are seeing tensions rise in the South China Sea. That's a pretty clear signal. Then, if you are awarded...
It's also a great problem statement for anyone who's listening in these spaces.
It's a massive problem. And if you have those and you are awarded a contract that is not quite production, but it is on the path to something big in production, you have a pretty good sense as a venture capital investor that there's enough there to go say this is worth putting some capital into. So while we couldn't find that path to DoD saying here's $1 billion, you kind of stack these paths together. And hopefully, if you have the right technology, you very quickly move into that program of record or that production effort.
I'd love to hear, especially, you said this so succinctly and eloquently that I think it'd be easy to sort of move over it. The production gaps you just described over the past 2 years, they're kind of unfathomable, especially given that this is a podcast called
Arsenal
of Democracy. So this could be off your company's lens. I'm just curious for you, like as a founder, thinking about these spaces, like what is your kind of just reaction to that gap and what we need to do broadly, like as a country, to kind of address that challenge there?
Great question. And this was last night. There were kind of these policy dinners, and it was one of the talking points at our dinner table. And I think the key is flexibility. Scale is the name of the game. That term gets used a lot because we need the ability to take a small number of people, a small amount of capital, and turn it into repeated products at scale, meaning shipping thousands of Stingers or hundreds or thousands of Gimler's missiles. That's the missile used in HIMARS. But flexibility is really key. We could not have guessed that these 40-year-old missile systems were going to come back into demand. And we cannot guess which systems are going to be in need in 10 years. So we need the ability to turn our factories around and turn our workforce around without it being extremely expensive and taking 5 years. So our approach in advanced manufacturing and automated manufacturing, really that is the problem we are trying to solve, and we have been trying to solve for years. And kind of before I leave that topic of the munitions gap today, I want to flag, we are seeing the same thing in space launch. It doesn't feel like it because SpaceX is doing such a great job, but if you take SpaceX out of the U.S., SpaceX is launching 80% of the U.S.'s payloads today. If you take SpaceX out, China is launching 4 times as many payloads as the U.S. So China's growth is exceeding the U.S.'s growth in space launch, even including SpaceX, no matter how successful they are. So while munitions and the gap there is really front of mind because we can see it, there's another one coming in space. And it's really terrifying.
It's fascinating. Who is your competitor, right? Because in the sense of there's obviously the defense primes, but this capacity kind of went away for a while already. you're referencing China, you're referencing Russia. Obviously, for national security purposes, we're not going to entangle those relationships again. But how do you think of like the competition side of this thing?
I think that the competition side is really complex. You brought up the 1990s and some of the challenging environments we put ourselves in using former Soviet Union propulsion. A lot of the consolidation that happened there hampered our ability to build a healthy industrial base. So I think in 1995, there were 15 plus individual suppliers of propulsion here in the U.S. Defense industry consolidation brought that down to 2 today. And those 2 now are not independent. They are underneath primes. Northrop Grumman is a major supplier and L3 Harris is a major supplier, which means we do not have, other than Ursa Major, any truly independent propulsion providers for munitions, for space launch, for hypersonics in the U.S. So the competition is a massive market vacuum that we have to go fill, and we are competing, like you said, with the primes that are serving their own self-interests, which in a lot of cases is great. They are accomplishing incredible missions as prime integrators. But if a new mission comes along, we need that nimbleness. We need that ability to have an independent voice of propulsion.
Something I'm curious about. You're based in Colorado, Blue Origin, Texas, SpaceX, Texas. Why are you in Colorado?
Very personal bias. I grew up in Colorado. So it was kind of an easy decision for a few reasons. Loved the area, and what that meant was it's a great recruiting spot. A lot of people love living in Colorado. We've been very lucky to find some talent that either already lived there or was happy to move there. The aerospace industrial base is really strong in Colorado. SpaceX and Blue Origin aren't there, although actually Blue Origin may have an office there now. But legacy Raytheon, legacy Lockheed Martin, some incredible Lockheed Martin facilities, and Ball Aerospace is out there, which means a lot of their supply chains were existent out there. So that was a key part of it. And then we build missile motors and rocket engines. We blow stuff up. We needed a lot of standoff space. We needed to be able to make a lot of noise. So Colorado was a really great spot for kind of our key operations at our headquarters.
As we're nearing the end here, something I'm really curious about, we've made reference to hypersonics a couple of times. Would love for you just to expand on that category. Obviously, this is one where there are huge great power rivalry implications with China and Russia, kind of state of the space, like what this even looks like, and then where you're kind of coming to it from.
Yeah, great question. It's funny, you brought up earlier on the kind of pitch deck of going to VCs and showing our capability set. We talk about those 3 areas that we've touched on. We talk about the gap in space and that it is only filled by SpaceX today. That's a huge risk. We talk about the munitions gap and that there is not an industrial base that is capable enough to fill it. And then when we talk about hypersonics, it's a very different challenge. It is a technical challenge. We have seen just in the last couple of years, China demonstrate really capable hypersonics in near orbital or orbital hypersonic vehicles. We've seen Russia demonstrate massive quantities of flight testing of hypersonics. So really what this means is 2 nations that are adversarial to the U.S. are demonstrating missiles that are hard to detect, hard to evade, and hard to deter at a level that the U.S. was behind a couple of years ago. So I'm much more optimistic. In the last couple of years, we've seen technology really advance in hypersonics. We've seen great early technological companies like Ursa Major. There's a great company here called Hermeus that focuses entirely on hypersonics. But the challenge is we're at the Reagan Institute where they talk about projection of strength. Strength can be manufacturing at scale munitions with flexibility to work on previous generation or next generation munitions. It can also be having the best technology. And hypersonics right now feel like that forefront of technology when it comes to missiles and kind of standoff capability.
Here's something I'm really curious about. You're once again fascinated because you're at the intersection of the kind of futuristic stuff, but also the deeply practical part. And something that tends to frustrate me in these conversations, I was chatting to someone who just works in tech and he was talking about, I wonder if the aircraft carrier doesn't make any sense anymore because, DF-21 missiles and maybe we could just have platforms that launch drones, and that's all fine. That's an important conversation. But at a practical level, we can't replenish our Stinger missiles. That's very much not sexy. It's very much not the Silicon Valley side of things. That's not the futuristic part. What is it like to kind of have to balance the need to focus on the sexy hypersonics, but also just the practical, wait a second, we need to restart factories. We have an aging workforce, and it's unclear where the replacements are going to come from. Because I think you're just at the center of the awkward juggle you have to do.
Well, I love that you're wrapping it up there, because that is exactly our value proposition is we, meaning Ursa Major, but we as the U.S. have to do both. We have to be at the forefront of technology, meaning, again, hypersonic capabilities are missiles that have to operate in atmosphere with high temperatures we've never faced. So you're doing materials development and you're using supercomputers to design these things. At the same time, these old factories that we have to stand up, we have to do so in an innovative manner. We have to pull humans out of the loop. We have to make sure this is automated manufacturing. It's safer. It's lower cost. It's more flexible. So it's innovation on two ends of the curve. There's the technological innovation and the industrial innovation. And we very much see ourselves in the middle. It's a really challenging and really exciting kind of position to be in. And I think it's easy to get lost in one or the other, but you really have to focus on both.
Joe, let's close here. Tell me something from a vision perspective optimistic about space, because we've talked about space from the defense industrial base is crumbling. We have these challenges, surprise attacks of hypersonics. Just, take us back to 2014 when you were probably not focused as much on the defense side. Close with like an exciting, positive sum, like opportunity in the space category.
Yeah, I've pointed to SpaceX's position as a challenging one for the U.S. We just saw, actually, news broke yesterday that Amazon Kuiper satellites are buying SpaceX launches. That shows how much of a monopoly it is. But the optimistic side of that, or the positive side of it, is SpaceX is launching, I think, 70-something times this year. SpaceX is launching more this year than the U.S. launched probably between the years of 2000 and 2015. It's incredible. We have more access to space today than we ever have. Costs are coming down. That means we can innovate. It means we can deploy new capabilities on orbit. We can replenish those capabilities more quickly. We're no longer talking about satellites with 20-year lifespans. You're talking about satellites with 1-year lifespans. We're going to see the environment in space shift much more quickly over the next few years than we could have imagined 20 years ago. So while there's a bottleneck and a kind of sourcing challenge, things are much more exciting than they were even 10 years ago. And I don't think we can really imagine what things are going to look like in another 10 years.
Excellent place to leave. Joe, thank you for joining us on the Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.